I've landed in dual diagnosis as a profession, speciality, but also recovery kind of sits underneath that. And in the literature, it talks about a recovery framework being a unifying framework to combine both mental health and drug and alcohol fields. So I guess I'll be talking from that perspective today and looking at what that means, but I won't necessarily be talking specifically about dual diagnosis. I'll be just talking about recovery more generally, and I know I'm aiming this at an AOD sector. First of all, I also want to acknowledge the country that we meet on is the Larrakia people, the custodians of this land, and I wanted to pay respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and I also wanted to acknowledge the ongoing impacts of colonialism. And part of this, I guess, is committing to learning other ways of knowing and doing and being, as Nick talked about yesterday, and committing to unlearning the ways of knowing, being and doing that have been harmful to people. So I thought I'd give you a bit of my own story about where I've come from and how I've landed in this as a profession. My family is very interesting. My mum's side is very working class, and her mother my mother and her mother lived in quite abject poverty when they were young. So I have that side of my background, the very working class, salt of the earth. But my nana was always really happy, just with anything and everything. And then I have the other side of my family who's very academic, and it's this interesting mix. And my father's father was the original Dr. Beckwith. He was always very grumpy. He had everything, but he was always not happy. So it was an interesting kind of merging of influences, I think, that's led me here today. I started training as a psychologist while I was working as a drug and alcohol counsellor. So I guess mental health has always really been intrinsically linked for me with drug and alcohol work. As I was training to be a psych and working in the drug and alcohol sector, I was, I guess, a bit disillusioned about what I was being taught. And then when I started working as a clinician, I just felt a bit lost with what I was doing. And I kind of felt that we were being taught like a very white middle class way of working with people, and Nick talked to that yesterday, and I was feeling that as I was going along. And then when I was working with people in clinical practice, I was thinking, well, I'm just managing symptoms here. I want to know what the big picture is. I want to know what we're working towards, like what helps people be well, what's our end game of treatment. I don't want to just, shoot fish in a barrel forever. So I guess that's when a PhD in recovery came up, I grabbed it with both hands so I could actually spend some time actually understanding what it is we need to be doing to support people who come to us, often in very vulnerable spaces, to move them forward, to make things better for them, to help them recover. And the one thing that I guess about the recovery approach I liked is it's a very different way of thinking about the problem. So a lot of the AOD field, a lot of research and a lot of money is put into research around understanding the problem itself. It's a very pathology-focused approach, and we're looking at what's wrong and just really intensely focused on that, as though understanding the problem helps us understand the solution. Whereas recovery comes from a very strength-based approach. We're looking at the positives in people, we're looking at what resources we have, and we're focused on well-being, we're focused on people living well, and we're trying to understand what happened to them rather than what's wrong with them. And a past colleague of mine had a really great analogy that he used. He rode motorcycles, quite big ones, and he talked about riding through the hills, and when he came to a corner, to avoid that corner, he wasn't focused on the corner he was trying to avoid, he was focused on the road where he wanted to go. And I think the same is that same focus and, where we want to go being the focus is what we need to be embodying when we're working with people. So I'm from that perspective then, and the analogy, looking at recovery science as a roadmap to how we work with people in addiction and how we help them to live better, feel better, do life better. But I also want to make a disclaimer, because obviously our drug policy is based on harm reduction, harm minimisation, and so we've spent a lot of time just trying to get people to understand that we do need to support people who might, be quite entrenched in drug use, or who just use on the weekend and it's not a big deal and they might not use for months at a time. Substances aren't causing them a lot of harm. We do still need harm reduction strategies. So what I'm saying today is not to say, get rid of that, bring in recovery science. I'm saying they need to work together based on where people are at. I'm using this roadmap analogy, and I'm really going to hammer that. And I want to make the point that there are many pathways to recovery. There's, some people can pull themselves out of an addiction. Some people need treatment. Some people go to AA and they're fine, and that's great. But there's a range of different ways that people get through that. And in saying that, there's also commonalities to those things at a kind of a broader level. So what we know is that what recovery looks like has two elements to it: the objective features that funders want to see, that friends and family want to see, that are observable from outside the person going through that journey themselves. So obviously there needs to be a change in substance use, and that could be a person's relationship with substance use. It could be abstinence, it doesn't have to be. It could be they want to stop using one substance and not other things that are not causing them any problems. It also involves an increase in their global well-being. So this is where the biopsychosocial model comes in. And we're looking at physical health, we're looking at psychological health, we're looking at how well people get along with other people and their overall quality of life. And then, broader again, we're looking at social inclusion. And this is a two-way street. So it's not just the person themselves in recovery engaging and participating in the world again, it's also that the world needs to embrace that person and support them and bring them back. So that's that two-way street. From the subjective side, from the experience of recovery itself, there's a very nice paper that looks at, the commonalities of people going through a recovery process, and they are that they feel more connected to the world, to themselves, to other people. There is a sense of hope that they develop, that things can be better. There's a shift in how they perceive themselves, their identity. There is greater meaning and purpose to life. And there's a sense of empowerment, that I can do things, that I can advocate for myself in the world, that I am worthy and I'm going to, grab life by the ears or whatever. But recovery is also a process. It takes a little time for people to go through this process. And we look at it in terms of different stages, and these are not set in stone, but in general, early recovery is your first year when you're learning and relearning everything and unlearning. Sustained recovery is about 1 to 5 years. So where people kind of cement everything they've learned, work out what life looks like anew. And then stable recovery is 5 years onward. And what we see is that at that 5-year point, the risk of relapse is about the same as any of us developing an addiction at any time, anyone in the world. So it's about 15%. So that's why we're looking at stable recovery. And at that point, people don't need a lot of the resources that we're going to talk about today, it's self-sustaining. So the effort required is less. Now, if we're looking at sustaining recovery, part of my PhD, I did a big literature review and looked at what were the things that actually help people maintain recovery longer term, not just through the treatment period, but ongoing. And there were a couple of things that really stood out. There was that change in social networks, so moving away from people who were embedded in heavy use in whatever way that looked like, and involving more people in their world that either didn't use heavily or were in a recovery network, but it didn't have to be like specifically recovery groups. It could just be other things that people did, networks that weren't focused on substance use. And in terms of how people explain that journey, there was always a sense of, I'm not who I used to be. So there was that change in identity. And so we looked for a theory that kind of understood that, or put those things together. And we came up with social identity theory. And what this theory says is that the groups you belong to shape how you understand yourself, or who you are when you explain yourself in the world. So it's not just people around you, it's the groups that they're embedded in, the values, the behaviours, the social norms, the dress, where you're located. And that can be people that you physically see on a daily basis or interact with, but it can be other sorts of groups that you belong to based in the kind of work you do or the country you live in or on, the culture, your interests, all that sort of thing. So, you know, you might be an avid model train collector, that might be your people. So we came up with the social identity model of recovery to explain this process of sustaining recovery long term. What this is basically saying is, over time, what recovery looks like is people moving away from networks and groups specifically that are heavily embedded in heavy substance use and gaining a sense of self as a substance user, or whatever words people want to put around that, you know, internalising that and feeling that is who I am. And then over time, shifting that balance towards groups that are not involved in substance use, are involved in other activities, are focused on other activities, and developing a recovery identity around that, and that balance shifting over time. And so what we found from the research we did to test this is that the more that balance shifts, essentially, from a using identity to recovering identity, the better the outcomes. So we did a number of different studies, and mainly they were with therapeutic communities. But we looked at 6 months after people came into a therapeutic community and, you know, their well-being, their life satisfaction, those sorts of things. And then after, 6 months after treatment, so once they'd gone through a long-term treatment program, the bigger that gap over time, the less their substance use, the greater their life satisfaction. So we're not just looking at substance use like a lot of the literature had in the past. We're looking at that broader perspective of what recovery actually looks like. We can't go on a journey without things in our bag. And this is what people need as they're going through that journey. So a little bit of background to this, because it's a strange term, recovery capital. And what it means is the resources people can draw on to support them. But this has come from, and we all know we live in a capitalist society, this has come from the theories around capital. There was a French philosopher called Pierre Bourdieu in the 80s who looked at this idea of economic capital and said, we actually have other resources that we use to do well in life. It's not just money that we need. We also need people. And with people, we create institutions, we create the groups I talked about, you know, we create social capital. And in that, those, you know, social worlds that we create is obligations to one another, there's resources that we can access, there's important things like trust and belonging and getting your sense of self. So that social capital is also something that we can use and draw on to move through the world. He also came up with the idea of cultural capital, which is understanding the world we live in and how it works, and, you know, the historical aspects of that, symbolisms that we use, and more concrete things like buildings and places. So understanding ourselves and understanding the world kind of in context. Then some sociologists came along from the drug and alcohol field, and they noticed that a lot of the research that we're doing focused on people who were at the lower socioeconomic end, lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum, I guess, and also looked at the people that weren't represented in the literature, which was what they called the middle class addicts, people who were living their happy little life but still develop addiction just like everyone else. And was like, what is it about these people that means that they are not coming up with the same outcomes that people at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum might? And they drew on Bourdieu's work around social capital and said it's the networks they're embedded in, it's the people that they know, it's the education that they have that allows them to be part of particular institutions. It's all of those resources that they can draw on to pull themselves out of difficult situations. So that was part of it, but they also then expanded on that and said, well, there's also personal coping mechanisms, there's resilience, there's understandings, the way we look at the world, you know, from that psychological perspective that people have that are different depending on, you know, where your social capital is. There's also physical capital, they called it, but we've merged it all into personal capital. Like they have a house, they have a car, they can get around easily, they might have great physical health. But also, it's not just who we know and what we have personally that we need. There's also the place where we live and what's available to us there. So they've also brought in the idea of community capital. And do we have access to resources? Am I in a community or a country that's heavily stigmatises drug and alcohol use? That the drug laws are going to punish me if I step outside a certain way of using and what I use, and so on and so forth. So recovery capital encompasses all these things, all these resources that we can draw on, not just within ourselves, but within the social networks that we belong to and the communities and country even in which we live. So that is a really big part of this picture. And the greater, obviously, the recovery capital that people have, the easier it is for them to move through the recovery journey. So what we want to do is also look at the recovery capital people have and increase that if possible. What gets in the way of us doing that, however, is stigma. And that will surprise none of you. But it's not just stigma towards people who use substances, it's also to us as a field, as a sector. Like, we don't get a lot of funding for the level of need that's out there in the community. A lot of services run off the smell of an oily rag. So there's also the development of the sector itself, you know, and this is where that interesting mix of mental health and AOD comes in. The mental health field sector developed from a very professionalised base. There's lots of people with fancy degrees, lots of money, do lots of fancy things. We come from a very peer-based perspective because of the stigma, necessarily. You know, helping one another out on the street, all that sort of stuff, because you can't go to a medical professional. You will get stigmatised, you'll get discriminated against. People instinctively know that. So that's where our sector really built from. If you look back through history, and AA has got together because it's people supporting people. So there's that side of it. But in terms of people themselves as well, going through this journey, stigma does get in the way of people building resources and what people have access to. And it's not just the fact that people have a dependence on some sort of substance. There's also those intersecting identities that people hold as well. Mothers who use substances have double whammy or triple whammy. Women and with children. Obviously, Aboriginal people are overrepresented in AAD treatment, in the jail sector, criminal justice system. LGBTIQ folk as well. There's like those intersecting stigmas that people need to overcome as well that get in the way of accruing resources. So if we look at this in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of need, for some people, those really basic physiological needs, or people who want to be in recovery, those basic physiological needs are what we need to meet first. It might just be a roof over their head, and there are programs in the world like Housing First that is the first thing, like the name suggests, the first thing people do, put a roof over someone's head to give them the basic resources to start building their life worth living. We need to feel safe. So many of the residents that come into our therapeutic community have been through fairly intense trauma, and or their childhoods have been really difficult, and they have never in their life felt safe with anyone. I would love to tell you some of those stories, but I don't have their permission to do so. But as a whole, you know, I have a number of clients that I work with that as a child just didn't have parents there for them. And the caregivers that they did have weren't really paying much attention to them. So feeling like their needs are going to be met was not something that they've ever had. And then there's love and belonging. I mean, you don't even get there. So we've got, you know, those first two rungs are what kind of recovery capital we're working with mainly for people in treatment, but people who recover other ways may have different experiences of that. People who have more resources, people who are middle class, people who have multiple social identities that can protect them from the stigma that they might suffer as someone with an addiction. So, recovery. How do we get here? I've given you a bit of a roadmap and what you need in your backpack and what you kind of can be fighting along the way. But how you get there really depends on where you start. It's the bottom line of this. So the pathways can look different for everyone depending on where they're starting from. But on the whole, how we support people in recovery is together, joining up services, working with communities to resource both people themselves and the communities that they live in, their broader social networks, and in that, reducing barriers so that we're meeting people's needs without stigma, without discrimination. And in doing that, we're individualising treatment based on the person's context. So there's two parts to this story. There's the broader sector, how we structure that, how we approach it, how we do community development work. And then in treatment, how we're actually working with that person, being fully aware of where they're coming from and where they want to be going. And that is the story of recovery. Do we have any questions? Yes, Peter.
When you're talking about sustained recovery and the evidence of what works, are there some techniques, tools that kind of focus, that you use or have found really useful to focus on looking at that change in self-identity and self-concept? What do you use to shift a person's internal dialogue about who they are?
Oh, I do. Yeah. So this is one of the things I do a lot with. Part of the TC model is moving people's identity. And for a long time, it's kind of been a given that just being there and being in a new environment changes who people are. But there is I didn't want to go into the identity stuff in great graphic detail in this because I thought I could be talking till the end of time. And I've got time now, so you're all in trouble. There's multiple aspects to this, and part of it is around that connection, because you cannot connect to other people until you connect to yourself and who you are. And as part of a developmental process, there's different stages to how we develop who we are. What I'm looking at with people is those social identities now, but also taking that from the context of how they've developed to get where they are. So during my PhD, and I think this is probably what you're hinting at, we developed a tool where we map out people's groups that they belong to and the substance use within those groups. And I probably don't have a picture here. And what we wanted to see over time was what I talked about earlier in that model of shifting people's identities from a substance using identity embedded in those heavy using groups towards a more recovery identity. So when we were mapping out the groups people belong to and the substance use within them, we're wanting to see the heavy substance use within their network reduce and more people who don't use or just use a little bit, who are in recovery themselves. So we get people to map that out over time. But I also talk to people about how identity develops in the different stages developmentally, from our early attachment period in the first couple of years to how we sort of understand the world and how it works within the context of our family, moving towards our peers and where we fit in with our groups and the cliques at school. High school was a horrible time for some of us for that. And then when we get to adulthood, the roles that we start to fulfill. And all of that shapes what might come out in that map. So without pictures, that's kind of what I'm working with. Does that nail it?
Well, how do you help someone shift? If they're internalising that I'm a substance user,
oh, yes.
their primary identity in their own mind, how do you help them move into a mindset where you're either reducing that or you're strengthening it to a different identity?
Yeah. So I don't spend a lot of time talking about substance use. I'm talking more about, with those groups that they belong to, what they've learned from those groups, what values are embedded in that, what value perhaps drug use holds in those communities, but that's not always it. And looking at what they've learned, what doesn't work, how they've managed to survive as long as they have, if they don't have any groups that they necessarily belong to. And looking at the other groups that they do belong to, embedded in this case, the therapeutic community and the values and behaviours and processes and all that kind of stuff we use to shift to another way of looking at those previous behaviours, values, behaviours. And that, it's not magic, obviously, but that also shifts the way they see the role of substance use in their life and how much that defines who they are, because they're focused on other things. It's not the focus of where they want to be. So, yeah, shifting focus. As I said earlier in my talk, yeah. Nice.
So I come from a community of peers, and I feel like a lot of your theory relates directly to our experience over the last 7 years. And in particular, what we've tried to do is cultivate community and our own culture of inclusion. But I wanted to ask you specifically about, because you talk a lot about stigma, and we get that fully, but also shifts in identity, where you say often you can't be what you can't see. And, you know, Chime is an integral part of our programs, as well as other wellbeing models.
Awesome.
So I just wondered if you could speak to that, because, and also the value perhaps of training around the use of lived experience, because it can be done very badly.
Yes, and I know there's people out in the world who would speak better to that than me. I'm seeing this whole picture of recovery as necessarily needing more than just the person and their immediate network, be that peers or treatment providers or whatever. There's a movement within broader society and I guess within advocates around reducing stigma and helping people understand that people who are struggling with addiction or struggling with their substance use aren't bad people, as we have so long been told, and it's now an inbuilt assumption that they must have done something wrong, it's their choice, all of that crap. And understanding this more in the context of, you know, that trauma, that life experience, that I've just had to do what I can to survive. So we're, you know, as a society, starting that conversation to challenge that stigma and having lived experience advocates, I guess is the word I want, to say, you know, I look like I'm doing great now, but it hasn't always been that way and this is my journey, and have that visibility of what some people call recovery champions. Is that a term you use?
I mean, I guess I'm speaking more to probably a peer worker in a multidisciplinary.
Oh, I see what you're saying. And how they would...
Yeah, and how, like, obviously clinicians have a role.
Yes.
And I really love the way you pose clinical versus recovery. We say what's wrong versus what's strong.
I like that. Yeah. And so I guess I work in a peer model. I work in the therapeutic community, which is very peer-based, and that in itself comes with its own challenges, but also recognising that there's an understanding that peers have that people as clinicians might not have, although some clinicians do. And you were asking, how do you navigate that? Is that your...
I guess I'm asking, how do you, a lot of what you presented resonates with what we try and cultivate in psychoeducation groups, but the role, you know, because I know I've experienced stigma from mental health professionals many times.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, so you know, there's this balance and a strengthening component to accessing a recovery champion or yeah.
Yeah. So it's that acknowledgement that there are different perspectives on the one thing, as Peter was talking about with the elephant yesterday, I think. Is that what you...
Sorry, I just said that's fine.
Oh, that's okay. But yeah, I guess, you know, there's that professionalised mental health kind of side that, you know, when I was trained as a mental health professional, I didn't have that training in what drug and alcohol looked like, what the drug and alcohol world was, and it was only because I was working in it that I understood that. So there's a lot of research that shows that having someone who has worked that journey before and can help people navigate that system that they're not familiar with, that they've been excluded from. And I guess I see the role of peer workers partly as that, but also as almost a translator in some ways. Is that how you perceive it?
Oh, I don't want to take everyone's time. I see it as good than that based on what we do in our programs. But
Yeah, it is that, like, it's almost like a coach kind of role. And I guess part of this for me is also with that broader look at stigma, kind of breaking down some of those miscomprehensions. Is that a word? Did I make that up? Like those misunderstandings of those strengths that people with that lived experience bring. And just from my perspective, like the incredible strength that takes to get through what a lot of people with lived experience have lived. I'm not sure what the question exactly was that I meant to be asking, but it's.
I just thought, like, just on the pure question of stigma and changing identity, like what the way, you know, Rocket works multiple roles, works in our team. And when Rocket comes and facilitates the program in front of people who've been through the justice system, have had addiction, their connection is almost immediate.
Yeah.
And the other thing they do is a walking, talking role model for recovery. So instead of trying to conceptualise their identity change, they see it instantly. So I guess I'm talking about the visibility of role models as well as the capacity building and help to navigate strategies and support to understand recovery and everything else that you do. But like just so much of what you said relates to the work that we do. Yeah, like the theory is not just what we try and practice.
That's reassuring. I think, I think some of this is the unlearning and learning from people with lived experience like yourself. You know, it's that professionalised model, and I was talking to Dan last night about, you know, how those things are siloed often, mental health and drug and alcohol, as well as like lived experience and professionalism. You know, that white person way of knowing, that professionalised, that middle class, that we can, you know, break everything up when what you're just dealing with is a person. And if we're looking at this from a social identity perspective and just seeing the common humanity that we all share, that is one way, I think, to break through a lot of the stigma. And just say, you've got a person in front of you, they're doing the best they can with what they've got. We either teach them how to do what they can, or we change what they've got to do that with, or both ideally. So yeah, that stigma stuff is a really, like, that is the sticking point, I think, for all of us, in no matter what capacity we're in, whether we're in policy, whether we're in funding, whether we're in, you know, a peer support role, whether we're in a professionalised role, all of that sort of stuff. It's, you know, identifying that we're all people doing our best. So thank you for highlighting that. Hi there.
Hi. When they have a new self-identity and they start, I guess, being friends with people who are not users, is there some inner turmoil to disclose who they were in the past, or are they then worried again about the stigma of who they once were with this new people?
I mean, again, everyone's different. So it does depend on, you know, all those groups that they belong to, what parts of their identity they might want to tap into. Because when we're joining a new group, we're joining that group often from either the basis of who we want to be, but also we're interested in that group for a particular reason. There's something within us that identifies with that group and wants to be a part of it. So while there's often that fear of the stigma that's going on, there's also other things that people can draw on that they can use to connect with a new group. And down the track, once there's trust and all of that sort of thing developed, once people have worked out whether this is a safe space or not, you know, people may disclose that. And perhaps earlier in recovery, when there's not a lot of resources built up, that stigma can be a bigger threat because it can lead to disconnection. But then again, you've got your middle class addicts, as they, like, I don't like that term, but that's what it was called in the literature, who already have all these other parts of their identity that, you know, the substance using part, the addiction part, it's not really that big a deal. You know, they might be a professional, they might be a mother, they might be a sports coach, they might be all these sorts of things. And they can draw on those identities to engage in new groups, in new situations, all that sort of stuff. If that makes sense. Yes, Dan.
Just really reflecting on the last two comments or questions and this excellent presentation. I think as a treatment provider, as someone who plays a small role in facilitating, you know, a recovery story, I think one of the worst stigmas that we can reinforce is, you know, that stigma of self. You know, I'm stigmatizing, and I'm putting myself in the position of someone in a recovery. You know, the stigma of who I was, and that trauma-informed approach of, you know, the first question shouldn't be what are you doing wrong. It's what's your story? What's happening in your story? What gives you strength? What puts you in a position of vulnerability? And so, you know, the shift of recovery is strengthen the things that keep you strong, mitigate and protect the things that put you at risk, and carry who you are into the future and engaging in your story in different ways. And I think, you know, that idea of, you know, for someone in recovery, don't look back because you'll see things that you won't like, or, you know, don't talk to peers with lived experience because you'll be triggered and you're vulnerable. You've got to embrace the strength that's there. And I'm not talking out of turn, but Rocket's talk yesterday was
amazing.
What an incredible story and what an incredible presentation. Because please, I don't want to speak for Rocket, but what I saw in that presentation yesterday was not someone who was someone and became someone different, but because someone who was so incredibly strong remained incredibly strong, and just had, you know, was able to shift that context. And I think that's what recovery is take what's there and you know, strengthen the strengths and mitigate against the vulnerability. And I think those last couple of comments have really, you know, put that to the front of my mind, that recovery isn't stop being something and start being something else.
No.
It's take those things and you know, encourage shifts and encourage different ways of contextualising, you know, your situation and who you are as a person. And you know, that goes back to what we talked a lot about yesterday. It's not bad to be yourself.
No.
We're not trying to change badness or correct wrongness. We're really looking at strengthening. That's what recovery is, isn't it? It's a process of strengthening and minimizing.
Yeah. And resourcing people and giving them, like, just keeping them going. Oh, you want to be there. Here's something else you need. I was going to explain it as, you know, that process, because, you know, we're all learning through it. Life. I'm still learning. There's heaps I have to learn and unlearn. As, you know, that when I'm working with clients, I'm looking at it as them learning to drive this big meat bag that we live in, and a brain that, you know, fuels it or is the pilot, whatever. But then also, I guess, working out how I use this to engage in roles that I fulfill, to connect with other people, and all of the things I've been taught about this and how to look after it to get me through life, basically. So it's learning about who we are first, I think, and how we work just as a human, and then using what we know and how we look after ourselves to engage in the world is one part.